lack of other vitamins, and they found that if they ate, that the Eskimos never had this problem. And so, because they weren't eating out of tins and they didn't have to worry, they were eating walrus and seals, and they were rich in a lot of nutrients. Now, you see this young mother and her child, they seem to be coated, and the answer is they are coated. That's how they kept bugs away from themselves, that's how they kept warm. They just wallowed themselves in blubber oil. And here's a typical way when we think about going on the Arctic or the Antarctic, traveling, this is how they would go. Dogs, huskies, and pulling sleds, and hopefully with skis. And how you'd know when the expedition began, you'd see there'd be 40 dogs, and then somewhere in the middle of the expedition, you'd see 20 dogs. And then near the end of the expedition, you'd see 5 dogs. And that's because they were eating the dogs. The dogs were not only their boon companions and their pullers of all their weight, they were also a food source, a very important food source, if they weren't able to capture anything. And this is one of my favorite shots because, again, only it's this week, I believe, the Zeppelin company is back in business. They're trying to produce a Zeppelin. You know, those are rigid airships. Everybody knows the Hindenburg. Well, they're back in business. They're going to produce more of these, except this time with helium. A little more understanding, won't be so explosive. Well, this gentleman here is Roald Amundsen. This is the great Norwegian explorer who did the Northwest Passage, the first one. He also took that Fram, the big boat that I showed you before, down to Antarctica, and he and his team went to the South Pole. They were the ones who beat the, I never like to say this, but this is how it's known. They beat Scott and his party. Well, they did more than beat Scott and his party. Scott and his party was stupid, because they killed themselves. And how they really killed themselves, they died of scurvy, basically. In weather that Amundsen and Perry were able to always move, Scott would stay in his tent. And so it took longer and longer for them to move forward. And in fact, when he finally perished, he had been in a tent in a storm for 4 days, writing furiously. And those are the famous words that everybody knows about. And his wife, interestingly enough, is the one who made him into this national hero, and now international in many ways. Whereas Amundsen, the conqueror of the South and of the North, was not revered in any way, even though he was first. In fact, today, at the South Pole, for example, there is an American base, and it's called the Amundsen-Scott base. They always put Scott in there. Amundsen went on to great things again. Now we're talking 10 or so years later, and he went with Lincoln Ellsworth, an American. He's Norwegian, an American, and Alfred Nobile. And they went in an airship over the Arctic, going across the pole. Because there's still a question, what really was down there? Because just because Perry may have made it across, we don't know what exactly was down there. So they're still now looking from the air. So they're supposedly one of the first to look. Admiral Byrd is also one of the ones to make it over there. There was articles about the fact that he may not have made it, but that's not true. I mean, those that knew Byrd knew he was one of the great navigators. There wasn't a question that he made it or not. Well, here's Amundsen. Amundsen was a fierce person. He got into fights with people and he'd hate them, but he always had a fierce conscience. This man disappeared in Nobile, the Italian, disappeared in his ship in 1928, in his airship. He went out after him, and he died in the Arctic ice, as he would have liked. That's where he ended his days. That's where he would have liked to live and die, and he did. This is what's called the Amundsen-Ellsworth-Nobile Transpolar Expedition of 1926. Now, what's extraordinary is that other than those two, I said Byrd and then Amundsen's trip on this airship, that was it for the pole. From 1909, they discovered the pole. That was it. Nobody bothered looking at it anymore. They weren't interested. Amundsen wanted to go over to see what it might look like, but that was about, say, 17 years later. Now, nobody else did anything with the pole until the USS Nautilus. The USS Nautilus was the first ship, the first nuclear submarine, as we remember, that went under the entire polar ice and crossed underneath where the pole line is, or the pole point, if you think of it like that. And this is returning to a grand welcome in New York Harbor. Within days of them doing this, the USS Skate also went to the North Pole. And here's a picture of the North Pole. The USS Skate came up under the ice. Now notice it looks a little pancakey. Now here we talk about our ice again. Now, the ice is basically at the North Pole in the northern regions anywhere from 3 to 5 meters thick. Think of a meter as about 3 feet. And then when it pans out like that, a pancake, and jumps up against each other, it opens up and smashes against each other, it forms ridges, which are called hummocks. And they can get 5 to 10 meters tall. Now, up until the time of the Nautilus, everyone thought that the ice underneath was the same way as the ice above. It turns out not to be the case. And in fact, the ice underneath, I'm talking about underneath the water, turn out, which we now call bummocks, go down to 75, 80, 100 meters. It's very unusual. It's like an iceberg. You always think that icebergs are buried underneath. Well, it's true. And this is one of those cases. And the Nautilus almost smacked into one of these underwater ice things. And luckily, they kept low enough. And they discovered that the ice underneath the polar regions was altogether different than they ever envisioned. Altogether different. Now it became a thing where every submarine had to go, every new submarine, American submarine, had to go up to the Arctic. And in fact, here we have 2 submarines within a year. This is all 1958, this is 1960. 2 submarines at the pole. And then they had 3 submarines. And today, the Arctic Ocean is always traversed by all sorts of submarines. Now, it's hard for us to think about this, but not too long ago, we were in a rather severe Cold War. Let's not kid ourselves. Everybody, these guys were not here for exploration. They were here to see what was happening with the Russians. And the Russians were also here, trying to see what was happening with the Americans. These are attack submarines. They're not sites from which people can address themselves. Now, when I went to the pole, interestingly enough, we have a situation where catch this. We're at the pole. That's what pancake ice looks like when you're breaking through. Again, about 3 to 5 meters. We have a thing where the pole, when we reached the pole in, again, July 12, 1996, what occurred was that at the pole itself, the ice again opens up periodically. The Russians call it polanas, which means lake. So in the middle of this great expanse, just you cannot see anything but ice, all of a sudden it opens up, and there's a lake. Surrounded by, the lake could be miles long, it could be a little lake. As you saw that little picture before, seems to be a little opening hole where the submarines were. Now this is what it would look like for me at the North Pole, because I'm in a Russian icebreaker. This was the most powerful icebreaker in the entire fleet, Russian fleet. An Australian, realizing there was opportunity here when the USSR faltered, went to the Russian authorities and negotiated a deal to rent these ships. In fact, the same fellow is now working on one for a nuclear submarine. So we may be going on another trip very shortly. A Russian submarine. Now, the Explorers Club joined in and rented the boat and then signed up people to go on this. The ship is about 300 feet across, at a complement of about 250 people, and we had 96 intrepid explorers with us from 22 different countries. Now, at the pole, I found a couple of things. For the last 4 hours of the visit towards the pole, I was on the bow of the ship. It was very cold, and we were amidst, very cold at least for that time, about 10 degrees with a lot of wind. It was snowing on and off, sleeting. All of a sudden, as we neared 90 degrees north, it opened up. The sky opened up, the sun came out, a big polana was formed, and seals. Those are seals. You can't really make them out, but there were seals at the pole itself. And not very far away, 100 yards away, was a U.S. submarine who told us in no uncertain terms, keep away. Now, as it turns out, this is what the North Pole looks like. That is the North Pole. So people have asked me, well, what does it really look like? Well, for hundreds of miles, it looks just like that. There is no change. Yes, crossing the pole itself, did I feel anything? Did the deacceleration occur to me? The answer is no. You feel nothing. And for the younger group, you know, we always have the problem and question of Santa Claus, and I have to always say, well, we missed him that day. Nonetheless, this is what it looks like. The head of the Explorers Club is a fellow by the name of Captain Fred McLaren, a former submariner himself. He actually took a ship, a submarine, to the pole. He got on the phone, the radio phone, and spoke with the submarine and said, "Hi, this is Captain Fred McLaren on the Russian icebreaker Yamal, and we'd like to come on board." He's talking to the submarine. The submarinist said, "Do not approach. Do not speak to us anymore. Please leave the area." He said, "No, you don't understand. We're here, we're Americans, and I'm a retired submariner," and he's talking, and of course they don't want to speak to him. Later, they wouldn't let us go on, needless to say. Later, these are international waters. They can't exactly say anything to anybody at this point to move away. We just couldn't come near them to try and go on and board them. Later, I asked the good captain what the situation was. Would he have considered, if he was a captain and someone, approached him from a Russian ship? And his answer was quite clear. "Oh, no, I would have shot him. I would have sent something over their bow and maybe sunk him." Because remember, they're all Navy men. They're all people who think of this as a military operation. And in fact, the people who ran this ship, while they claimed to be private citizens, they were all naval men. All naval men. Now, as I said, there are a number of unusual people on this trip. 22, maybe I didn't say it yet, but I will now. 22 different nationalities. This is Mr. Liao from Taiwan. Mr. Liao was one of the strongest people I've ever met. Look at those hands. He was a 6th-degree judo expert. And he and his wife, who's stronger than he is, decided to come on this trip. Mr. Liao is 79 years young. He was a bull, to say the least, and he loved. There were translators on this trip there were, I think, 14 Taiwanese. But he could speak a little bit, and he loved to talk about New York. Loved talking about New York through the translators. When we reached the pole, the ship brought out a pole, a North Pole, and stuck it down there, and so people took pictures at the North Pole pole. This particular gentleman with the yellow boots is Ludwig Chang. Mr. Chang is a Chinese man who is an American who actually lives in Stamford, Connecticut. Was brought in as one of the translators. It turns out he works for Chase Manhattan Bank. But he was brought in for this special occasion just to speak to these Taiwanese. The problem was he speaks mostly Mandarin, not really Taiwanese, so he needed another translator to help him. Terrific guy, by the way. This gentleman is Mr. Dmitry Mendenhall, the third mate. The third mate is the boat on the side here. The third mate. Now, one night, and we'll get to this very shortly, I'll show you the bridge of the ship. In fact, maybe the next shot. Yeah, that's the bridge. The bridge was a very large bridge, and it was available. All parts of the ship basically were available, or we would tour. Even the nuclear plant, we would look at it. We wouldn't go into it. There were KGB on the ship. I mean, I don't want to make it anything but that. After a while, everybody became very friendly, and the Russians would point out who the KGB guys were. And they would say, "KGB, come over here, Ivan," and they'd show him your card. Sure. What would it look like? KGB? No, it doesn't really say that, but they would make fun of them, because after a while, he got very friendly with the Russian crew. This is Fred McLaren being interviewed, Captain Fred being interviewed by a German TV crew, because this was such a special expedition. They wanted to film it for the continent, especially for the Germans. Now, what was happening was, you can see there are bases on tables here where they would have a lot of the charts. And you could always look at the chart and always keep track of where you were. And they always kept it up. One night, and I guess I should make this very clear, remember, this is the land of the midnight sun. The sun never set. Now, some of you may think that's disconcerting, but in actuality, it isn't. You feel like very enervated. You sleep less. It's only when I returned and finally saw the sun set and darkness again that you got an effect. So having the sun around all the time doesn't affect you, except in a more positive way. So here I am one morning around 3:30, and the third mate is up here with me, and he's doing his duty, but I'm talking to him. He loved speaking in English and trying to learn English words. I'm trying to learn Russian words. And I was talking to him about the chart that we were looking at that particular point, and he said, looking at me straight in the face, "These are, of course, the fake charts." I said, "What do you mean, the fake charts?" "The fake charts. Well, what does that mean? He said, these are the charts we give for the Americans. I said, well, how do you move the ship? You know, through charted waters. Oh, well, we have the real charts over there. Behind Fred McLaren, there's a little door that leads into like a closet. So here we have, after the fall of the USSR, the Russians haven't changed one iota. And those who have gone to Russia know that the same 6 people that always looked at you when you went through customs, they're still there. They haven't, like, taken them away. They're still there. They still want to bother you. They still do everything possible to create a little bit of furor and to think you might not get in, or much less get out. In this case, they have all these charts. They have these charts to disseminate wrong information. So you have a coastline with a giant mountain range when there isn't one. Or there is a mountain range and they don't put it in the right place. Or there's a river. Or they put a submarine pen. Or it's all fake. So here, we were on this ship now for a week and a half and they're still showing everybody these fake charts. Extraordinary when you think about it. What was the purpose? Why haven't they switched up? Why don't they just rip them up? Well, the Russian mentality has not changed that much. In fact, Russian cities are the most unknown places, even for the Russians that live in them. They have no idea where they are, because there were never any street maps made. And if they were made wrong. Now, the military has it, of course, but the Russian people don't have it, and we certainly wouldn't get it, because nobody wanted to say where anything was. So it hasn't changed much at all. This is Fred McLaren at the pole. Notice anything unusual about the sign? See the H of north? Remember, the Russians really deal with acrylic. That's their type of writing. So they thought the H was an N. No, that's 90 degrees north. Now, when I say there were unusual people, there were 7 physicists on this trip, maybe 25 flyers, aviators, at least that number of shipmen, you know, people that have been captains or mates on ships. These were people who wanted to come up to this. They had many reasons, but they wanted to be here. This particular gentleman was one of the people who spoke with us. This is one of the great explorers of the 20th century. This particular gentleman is named Wallace Herbert. He made a transpolar expedition in 1968 through 69 that was worthy of all the greats that had ever done a trip. He went from Baffin Island in Canada over a 16-month period across the North Pole to Svalbard, one of the islands. Great trip, one of the spectacular trips. When he came back to England, where he lived, to begin the campaign to pay back the trip and to discuss this great expedition, it was his fate to come back on the day that men landed on the moon. So if you think about the anachronism of a man's life, and he spent the next 20 years of his life trying to get over the fact that his whole life was dedicated to getting across the pole and doing all, and it meant nothing, and he was ignored, completely ignored. If those of you who remember that week, I mean, what other news was there that week? There was a lot of news, but you didn't know of anything else. And this man became, interestingly enough, for a long time, he became like Perry. He went up to Greenland and lived there for many years with the Eskimos. Became a writer. He's a painter of some note. Very interesting fellow. I enjoyed talking to him at night because I knew the history of the explorers, and this guy knew either the sons or the daughters, and might possibly even know the great ones themselves. He knew Sir Edmund Hillary, close to him. He knew Sir Evelyn Fuchs. These are British mountaineers. He knew of Shackleton's son and grandson, the great Sir Ernest Shackleton. How many people know who Ernest Shackleton is? Nobody. Oh, my goodness. Sir Ernest Shackleton, it's not merely Scott, who's the most famous English explorer of the Antarctic. It's Sir Ernest Shackleton. And Ernest Shackleton never lost a man. That's the main thing. He always brought his men back. He was called the boss, and he always brought his guys back. But he followed the British technique, and he would man-haul. And I really mean that. They would they just tromp through the snow, taking their big sleds with them, and he wouldn't use skis, to their chagrin. Now here we have Edmund Ball. Edmund Ball was 92 years of age. Went on this trip, right? Edmund Ball turns out to be what a spectacular character. Well, Ed Ball runs the Ball Industries. Now, most people know it if you can anything, canning goods, the canning jars, that's Ball Industries. Well, they branched out. His father started the firm, and he ran it for many years. Now, of course, he's retired. He's still operational with it, but he retired from it. And they're the people that, their aeronautical division are the ones that repaired the Hubble spacecraft. His people did it. He knew all about the Hubble. What a talk. And he had all these little things like a bicycle. So here we have the first man to bicycle at the pole. Of course, he had me, Mr. Bronx, to tamp it out, make the bicycle, stick him on it, and ride him, push him along so he could have his first bicycle run. And for that, Ed told me, all right, now get on here, you try it. And there I am going on a bicycle. It's sort of sullying the purpose, but for the moment I went on the bicycle. But what you will not see is the first crash of a bicycle at the North Pole, because it only went like 5 feet there. Now, if you take a look out on the distance, you start to see beyond the person holding the pole. You see these hummocks, these things where the plates would smash into each other and rise up. And again, some of them were fairly tall. If you look out over here, they got to be about 15 or 20 feet high. So about 7, 8 meters right over there. We went up there. We were about a mile away. We could walk all around. Now you might say, well, gee, are we taking a chance? It looks like the boat was just plunked there. And the truth is it was. It stops wherever it was. This is a completely self-sufficient ship. It had a complete shop. It could take care of itself. If it lost a screw, which a couple of years ago it did, it could replace it itself. I mean, they had these giant propellers. It was a completely efficient place. You felt like it could go anywhere, like the North Pole, and it did. Now, some of you will ask at some point, what does it sound like there? But first, let me just say, see this gentleman here? Whenever we went on the ice, the Russians would send some of their men out with rifles for polar bear scares. Because I want to make it clear to you, we think we're the highest end of the food chain. Well, we're not. It's the polar bears who are the absolute top of the line. They go up to, and in fact, polar bears have been found as close to the pole. If there are seals there, there'll be polar bears. They're huge. They're 1,200 pounds, some of these males. One swat, and they pull up a 200-pound seal and just chomp it down. We saw quite a few, actually. Now, this gentleman here is Edwin Smythe. Edwin Smythe, as I told you, all of them have a physicist. Everybody seemed to have a story. This man worked with Werner von Braun on the Saturn V rocket. He was responsible for a good deal of the inner workings of the way in which they got back. Not got up, but got back. That was his end. And so the moon landings, this man was responsible for. It was very interesting to have him speak to Wallace Herbert, the great explorer. And actually, they didn't talk much. They didn't get along at all. Now, he brought with him what is called a GPS. Now, how many people are familiar with a global position system? Anybody here? Well, this is the new revolution. Okay, some of you are travelers. You've perhaps seen this stuff. This is a handheld version. What this is, a global positioning system, is 24 satellites that go around the Earth, some over 24,000 feet up in the air. Up in space. No air up there, up in space. And you need 3 of them to get an exact sighting, and a 4th one to get elevation. And as long as you can get, this is a receiver, they give out radio frequencies, you can find your way anywhere on this Earth. So the old day and age of setting up longitude and latitude of the great Ptolemy in the 3rd century of the Common Era, trying to figure out where Rome was, and in juxtaposition to perhaps Memphis in Egypt. I mean, he was trying to attempt to see those things. Well, today, they have a machine like this. And in fact, we got to the North Pole on a Russian ship using American technology. The other thing I want to make mention of this is that English is the common language around the world. The story that the Russians might be the language, or German might be, well, the French are always trying to lay claim to it, and the Spanish maybe. Well, the answer is the official language around the world is English. English is used by pilots, for boats when you're coming into a river. They come on board and they usually pilot you in. They always speak English. When you go into an airport, when you're in a plane and you're coming in, all pilots speak English. Whatever nationality, they speak English. And that's the official language. So, ladies and gentlemen, we won the Cold War. In case we didn't know it, we won the cold and the hot one. And as the century ends, America reigns supreme. So for all of our complaints, for all of the problems, we did it. We succeeded. And we put Americans at the pole on a Russian ship. And here is a handheld GPS, global position system, that shows us 90 degrees. There we are. And then it circled around. And so we went around the point. I always like this shot of the Yamal. This is the English words, obviously. The acrylic is on the other side. This is a Russian doctor who, a couple of years before, the first time this was rented, met a woman who helped to set up the group. Was just assisting, and eventually he married her. We don't know whether he knew at the time that the woman was an heiress whose mother owned a good deal of Beverly Hills. He now lives in Hawaii, and he came back on this trip to see his old friends. So I took this pensive shot of him, and I gave it to him. And I said, gee, I guess you feel kind of bad about, not being with your old mates. He said, yes, but Honolulu is very nice. Yeah, the Russians understand. They understand a lot of this. They have quite a few people. Now let's look at this ice at the pole. That little piece right there is about 4 meters thick. Now, when you see the blue ice, they're all different colors, but when you see the disgusting ice, you may see pictures of it sometime on TV. That's plankton. That's the stuff that the critters, that the seals are eating, for example. That's good when it's yellow, brownish. That's what the seals are working with. That's what the birds will eat, etc. And this flat pancake thing, it opens up. Now, what that is just the ship has created this open end here. Now, the thing about the ship is that here's a closer view of that piece of ice. Again, this is about 9-10 feet tall. It looks small, looks like nothing, but it isn't. It's big. Everything gets dwarfed by the expanse of the ice. Now, here's the radio room, and I made sure to become friendly with the radio operators, because my great plan on the day of the pole was to call back to my ground control, my wife, and to report the momentous occasion. Now, below 85 degrees latitude, you can use the satellites for phones. Above, you have to use radio phones again. It takes a while. It took me 3 hours to connect. It was some Polish ship that was getting in the way all the time. They wouldn't let it connect. And so finally we broke through. And this is a handheld job where you pull it, you squeeze it, and you say your words, which in my case were, have reached pole. And you open it up, and you wait, and all you hear is static, static, static. You don't hear anything. Have reached pole, and nothing. This went on for minutes with the radio operator joining in. Yes, he's made the pole. We're here. We're here at the pole. And finally, I hear my wife's voice, one word, wonderful. I know she heard it. I'm done. Well, that little phone call just for you, ladies and gentlemen, cost $128 to report that wonderful. But it was wonderful to report. I stepped back from there and went back to this is right on the other side of the main area where the ship is run. And lo and behold, the captain was there. And I went to the captain, and it's Captain Smirnoff. No, not the vodka man, but this is Andrea Smirnoff, an austere military officer. Now, he always had a translator with him. And the translator was always speaking into his ear, but you could see by his glint in his eye that he understood. Now, maybe he didn't understand, Taiwanese, Chinese, but he certainly understood English and Spanish and things of perhaps French. And so I went up to him, and I decided there was no question he understood. And I went up to him, and I said, Captain, I want to thank you for bringing us to the pole. This is a momentous day. I shook his hand. I said, I've just called my wife and told her that I've made it here. And the captain looks me straight in the eye and says, from the pole to home, wonderful. I step away, thankful that I've touched across the bases of being with this Russian captain who wanted to bring people to the pole, who reveled in the idea that people actually wanted to go to the northern area. And remember, the Russians thought this was a very soft operation. All they had to do was go someplace. During the year, during the winter, it's the worst possible. It's great duty. The best food, the best. They have doctors on board. They're taken care of. But it's miserable weather. You know, it averages